Alrighty, folks, Zelensky's getting desperate. Interesting timing on his latest outburst. It comes just after the GOP House in the United States passed a budget deal. It's not a real budget, but it's like a continuing resolution, I guess, that guarantees unlimited funding for Ukraine through January of 2025. The Pentagon, the federal government, they can spend as much as they want on Ukraine, and it will never hit up against the debt limit. Ukraine has not been given a blank check, but the President Joseph Robinette Biden, has been handed a blank check or an unlimited checking account from which he can write blank checks to Zelensky. And is that good enough for him? No. Now that Zelensky's essentially gotten a blank check, he's demanding more, because he knows there's no amount of money that could actually save his ass from certain doom. Despite Ukraine's unlimited budget, they are slowly losing to the Ruskies, and they are hemorrhaging resources at an unforeseen rate. And by unforeseen, I don't mean unpredictable. I mean this has never been seen before. We have never seen a war where this much military hardware has been pumped into such a small area and expended so rapidly in the course of a year. I've said in the past that this is, the biggest war that the Western world has been involved with, since the Baltic Wars, the Yugoslav wars of the 90s. This might be the biggest war since Korea, as far as the planet is concerned, It's at the very least, I think, at this point, on par with the Iran-Iraq war, which in and of itself, people at the time recognized, this is like World War I style of combat. That's what was going on between Iran and Iraq. It was one of the worst wars of the 20th century. Obviously, there were a lot of bad wars in the 20th century, and they were in the 20th century was the worst century for war in human history. But we seem to be on that level of conflict here with Ukraine and Russia. And so Zelensky is demanding so much more than a blank check and unlimited resources. He's demanding full NATO membership, which of course means that he wants the entire Western world, all of NATO, meaning the United States. It's all these implications that are that are built on top of one another. But essentially, what Zelensky is saying is he wants American boots on the ground in Ukraine fighting the Ruskies, which inevitably would lead to thermonuclear war. That's what this man is calling for. He's been calling for it for quite some time. In fact, he overtly in the past called for Ukraine to receive to get its own nuclear weapons, to even the playing field with Russia, because we're going to trust Ukraine with nuclear weapons. Well, I wouldn't put it past the psychopaths who run the West in the modern day. Emmanuel Macron, one of the more rational Western leaders, one of the so-called adults in the room, despite the fact that he's like 35 years old, he seems to be on board with the idea of admitting Ukraine to NATO. Oh yeah, let's just let Ukraine in NATO. And so we've been hearing this for a long time. In fact, what started this whole war was the refusal of the United States and the NATO countries to guarantee to Russia that Ukraine would not join NATO. For obvious reasons, Ukraine joining NATO would be a direct threat to Russia. Russia has had their base in Sevastopol, which is now disputed territory, going back to the 19th century. That's their only warm water port. That is a fundamental component of Russian national security. It's non-negotiable for them. And so if Ukraine, which claims ownership over the Crimean Peninsula and does not want Russia to have a military base at Sevastopol, if they were to join NATO, NATO would quite likely go to war to reclaim that disputed NATO territory. NATO defends its own borders. That's a part of the alliance. And so Russia does not want the possibility of American troops invading Crimea to root out Russia's only warm water naval base. Russia does not want to be cut off from the Black Sea. Russia also does not want nuclear weapons right on their border. In fact, if we remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, what was it that both sides could agree on? You see, JFK, he put nukes in Turkey. And that was really close to the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev didn't like that. So Khrushchev said, you know what, I'm going to put missiles in Cuba. See how that Kennedy guy likes it. And it was an act of brinksmanship. Khrushchev was a risk taker, and you know what? It paid off for him. Because Kennedy called him up and he said, hey, you know what, Khrushchev? You got me. I see your point. Let's both agree to back down. I pull my missiles out of Cuba. You pull yours, or I pull my missiles out of Turkey. You pull yours out of Cuba. Everyone shook hands, and they went about their day. That's the way that the West and the East used to communicate. There used to be strategic empathy. That's the term that's used by John Mearsheimer. How are you going to interact with your supposed enemy if you don't understand his own perspective? How are you going to know how to react to his actions and try to bring about a situation that's closer to your heart's desire if you don't think about how your actions are going to impact the other side of the negotiations? And the answer is just arrogance, stubbornness, a sense of superiority. Well, the Ruskies just have to do what we say because we're righteous and they're evil. We're the good guys and they're the evil empire. So every time I do one of these updates, Zelensky's, asking to join NATO again. The situation is getting worse because Zelensky's getting more desperate. People in the West, they're very happy to let Ukrainians keep dying and dying as long as they're fighting Russia. But what are they going to do when it becomes clear that Ukraine is on the brink, that Ukraine is about to collapse and is going to be defeated by Russia? At that stage, will the folks in the West say, okay, well, now we finally have to step in? Because, the folks in the West, you have to remember, are not concerned with saving Ukrainian lives. That is not their concern. Their concern is hurting Russia. And for now, just supplying the Ukrainians with weapons is hurting Russia. This is the case that we hear from people who support arming Ukraine. They say, hey, it's not costing any of our lives. It's just costing us billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to arm Ukraine. And so that is a price that, we should be willing to pay to hurt Russia because we're doing damage to Russia. We're killing Russian soldiers. Well, at some point, that's not going to be enough. And the Ukrainians will have killed their last Russian. At that point, will NATO say, you know what? At this stage, let's step in ourselves. Russia's been weakened, and let's kick Russia while they're down. Nobody's asking these questions. Nobody in Washington is asking. Nobody in Brussels is asking. Because we're not run by serious people. You don't have the journalists asking this question. Back in the infamous 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the media was all over asking, what are the implications of this? What's going to happen? How's President Kennedy going to defuse this situation? Nobody sees any risk now. Nobody cares. They care about optics. They care about virtue signaling that they stand with Ukraine. Could you imagine if during the Cuban Missile Crisis, people just started slapping, I stand with Turkey bumper stickers on their car to say, screw you, Khrushchev, we're not pulling missiles out of Turkey. What are you, crazy? We will defend. And remember, Turkey was a NATO country. That's why Turkey got nukes. That's why there were American nukes in Turkey. And you think the Russians don't remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Imagine if it was instead... Well, you know what? I'm not even going to go through it because it's cliched at this point. Everyone's heard the comparison to Mexico. I don't need to make it. You've heard it before, whether you like it or not. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.